Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Rise About Justice Movement podcast. My name is Zachary Mallory, and I am the host of the Rise About Justice Movement, the podcast, and the founder of the Rise About Justice Movement. Today, I would like to give a viewer discretion is advised due to the nature of the topics that we will be discussing. Today, I am joined by my friend Leah, who is an RN and BSN and has been a nurse since 2009, working in a variety of specialties. This episode is a part of our series to recognize and uplift survivors, not only during Domestic Violence Awareness Month, but to continue ongoing the support for survivors. As a survivor myself, I want to say welcome to the podcast, Leah. Feel free to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much for having me. Introducing myself, I feel like could go on forever because I feel like I've done so much within the nursing specialty, which is, one of the perks of being a nurse is there's endless things that you can do to help your community. But I started as a nurse in 2009. I started as an ortho trauma floor nurse, and then I went to the operating room. While I was in the OR, I did do travel nursing for about 7.5 years. And that was until COVID hit. All the surgery stopped. I loved Colorado, so I decided to go permanent in the state of Colorado, where I started working at the nurse advice line. And this is kind of where my interest in forensic nursing started. I noticed that we were getting a ton of calls during the COVID time for domestic violence and sex assault, mainly because it was a scary time to even try and step into the hospital just because of all of the unknowns, and it was so busy in the emergency room. So I was getting a ton of calls asking what they should do, and really there weren't any other resources medically other than going to the emergency room after an assault. So I wanted to know a little bit more just because I was getting a lot of questions, especially with sex assault. Can I eat? Can I drink? I've already showered, things like that. And so I actually found a free online course through UC Health, their Sane Safe program. So I completed the online didactic and then did the clinicals down in Colorado Springs. And I just learned so much more than you know, thought I would ever know about domestic violence, sex assault, and human sex trafficking. And it really changed my point of view as well, because I feel like I was kind of in that same, I guess, mode as like the average person. If the abuse is so bad, then why don't you just leave? Or you need to make sure you're not putting yourself in those situations, as opposed to really, if somebody's going to assault, they're going to assault. And it's not ever the victim's fault. So I feel like it's not just made me more aware for people in the community, people in my own life, but also for my patients who have, you never know who has experienced sex assault or domestic violence. And so I think it's really important for healthcare workers, even if they don't want to go into forensic nursing, to even just get that education of trauma informed care for patients who have experienced sex assault and domestic violence. So from there, I got my certificate to practice as an FNE SANE. I worked as an FNE SANE for the last 4 years. I did step away recently in April due to my own vicarious trauma from doing this work and working with survivors. Um, and I've kind of transitioned into more of a research path. So currently, I'm working through a university, um, university research department. And we're doing is running 3 different studies trying to find what practices can best help prevent or decrease PTSD in sex assault survivors. So I think for me, that has transition has actually been really great for my own mental health as well. I feel like working as an FNE sane really, while it's so meaningful, and it was heartbreaking to quit that job because it was the first time in my nursing career since 2009 that I felt very fulfilled in what I was doing, as far as advocacy goes for my patients. Um, but what was really difficult was seeing, how much our system, not just within the legal departments, right, the law enforcement, our judicial system, but um, even all the way down to our healthcare system, really fails these patients. So it was tough to leave, and leave that advocacy role, but I feel like now in the research, I'm working towards an end goal as opposed to when I was working in the hospital, it felt like a revolving door. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm also for my mental health and working as a med spa nurse. Nobody is I love it because nobody is hurt, nobody is assaulted, nobody is dying. And so it's kind of like my side job, to kind of give me a little respite, from the trauma. And then I'm also working as an acute care discharge nurse.
I think being a med spa nurse is definitely a change of pace
Yeah.
outside of like everything else that you're used to seeing. So I can imagine how that definitely can be, yeah, like I said, that change of pace and just recognizing that, well, maybe there is more to life than a lot of stuff that's going on right now, because there's a lot of things that are happening right now, and domestic violence is literally running rampant through our communities, and it is deeply devastating. And
Yeah, absolutely.
I would love to talk about, what you witnessed and what you heard from people during COVID, being on the advice line. you know, there was a very high rate of domestic violence at that point in time, because I mean, if you're literally stuck at home with an abusive partner, or family member or whoever, I'm imagining some of the calls that you would have received, and there's probably a lot of horror stories with that. And you mentioned something very deeply about vicarious trauma, and that'll be a future question that I'll ask you here in just a bit. But I would love to learn about more about what you witnessed and what you heard being on that advice line.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it during COVID, not only were people now working from home, right? There are a lot of people that transitioned out of the office. Now they're working from home. So there's literally no rest from it. They're just around all the time. But also the number one indicator for femicide in a domestic violence situation is if the abuser is unemployed. So, you're seeing an uptick in domestic violence homicides as well. And really no time, no space for somebody to try and get away to go and get help through a local advocacy center or try to create a safety plan, to even get away just because that abuser is around 24/7. Um, and then you also think about the lack of resources as well, for somebody in a DV situation. Do they have a mode of, communication? Do they have a cell phone? Do they have a car to even get away? Um, So, and then even in that time, is there even room within the advocacy centers, like the safe shelters, for that amount of people that were needing to get away? And what if somebody comes in and they have COVID? And things like that were just kind of spreading throughout, throughout these shelters, and it was making it really difficult to even get help during that time.
And I can imagine, it's like we're repeating the cycle of, ending a lot of the funding and looking at what's happening like nationally in Congress, the government shutdown, and then like, the Department of Justice attempting to remove this critical funding for direct service providers. It sets a dangerous tone and precedent for the country as well. And it's deeply devastating. And, I speak from a survivor perspective that it's very alarming. It sets a very dangerous tone. Our president, and I put that in parentheses because I'm not very, I'm going to keep it mild. I'm going to keep it PG. I have a lot of thoughts about this, but eliminate by saying and by see, I get tongue twisted because it's one of those things like, and it's so deeply devastating. But whenever you have a elected official, and this goes beyond the president because there's others that are also aligning with this specific talking point, but hearing an elected official state that a quote unquote spatter between a husband and a wife should not be reported. And essentially, he downplayed that domestic violence exists. I'm living proof. My mom is living proof. Those callers that you experience on the advice line are living proof to the ongoing domestic violence epidemic and the issue that we have running rampant through our communities, especially through marginalized communities, even more at risk. I want to
Yeah.
pivot really quick and talk about something that's going on in the Kansas City area. We have a very high epidemic, and it is very deeply devastating. But 19, I believe, is the last number that I saw. It might be 18 or 19. Of the last homicides just this year alone in Kansas City are domestic violence related. Now, I want to highlight something that the Jackson County prosecuting attorney is doing, and she's brand new to the office, but I'm deeply excited to learn about the work that she's doing because she actually just launched a public dashboard where they will be tracking domestic violence cases. And her name is Melissa Johnson, and she used to work under the mayor of Kansas City's office as his director of public safety. And then she ran for prosecuting attorney, and she won. Now, the dashboard that they just launched, and I'm actually excited because they did it in honor of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and she was actually dressed in purple, head to toe, and she was surrounded by attorneys, victim advocates, and then there's also therapy dogs that she has within the office as well. And they created this new public data dashboard showing 9 years of data surrounding the prosecution of domestic assault cases. Prior to arrival, 90% of domestic violence cases were handled at the municipal level, and penalties for offenders were minimal. Now, all domestic violence cases will cross her desk. So essentially, she's taking this from this municipal level to prosecuting on the county level, which also ups the charge of domestic violence and intimate partner violence cases that she will be, prosecuting. And there's a quote that she did in KMBC, which is our local ABC affiliate. And she said, quote, after I was sworn in about 10 months ago, I directed law enforcement partners and municipal prosecutors to send serious domestic violence cases, including those involving weapons, broken bones, strangulation, and repeat offenders, to be sent to our office where we do have the tools to seek serious consequences that match the serious conduct we see in our community, hopefully breaking the cycle of violence before it becomes fatal. The dashboard data shows Johnson has filed over 70% of domestic assault cases referred to her office, which is up from 54% in 2024. She has filed 38 more cases than the office filed by October 2024 involving intimate partner violence, or also known as IPV. So this dashboard categorizes intimate partner violence as a broad term that compromises physical violence, sexual violence, stalking, or psychological harm by a current or a former partner or spouse. IPV can occur between heterosexual and same-sex couples alike and does not require sexual intimacy. I'm really glad that she included this aspect into it. Like, this is deeply incredible to see her doing this work. So hearing that, what's your initial reaction to that? And what do you think whenever you hear about this dashboard? Because I think this is going to show us exactly what's happening in our communities.
Yeah, I think that, having more resources like that to collect data is never a bad thing. I think when it comes to the legal side of things, when we know for sure that one person is the abuser, the only thing that's going to really stop this or change this at all is accountability. And so having those harsher punishments, I personally, this is my personal opinion, I think is necessary. Now, what I did have seen as a forensic nurse, especially within the domestic violence realm, is that we need to have better education in our law enforcement officers, to be able to actually see who the abuser is when they show up to the scene. Because there have been so many times where I'm doing a strangulation assessment on a patient, a DV patient, who's in 4-point handcuff to the bed because they were the ones that were arrested at the scene. And they're the ones that are being charged with domestic violence charges. And it's because if you think about like the fight or flight aspect, there's fight, flight, freeze, fawn. But in a lot of these cases, especially when you're being strangled, we know that 50% of people who are strangled won't have any external injuries, but they'll have internal injuries. But 65% of assailants, while they're strangling the victim, will have scratches to the back of their hands and to their face. A great example of this would be the Gabby Petito case, where you saw when they were pulled over, Brian Laundrie had scratches to his face. And so being able to figure out which one is the victim and which one is the perpetrator is going to be really important in this instance, because there can be instances where it's the victim that's actually the one being charged with domestic violence abuse. And we also need to remember that just like women, men can also be victims of domestic violence and women can be perpetrators. And so I think if you're going to have these harsher punishments, you're going to be taking more people to court over this, you're going to be, having this whole database. We first need to start with the education at the very beginning and educating law enforcement so that we don't, we need to get this right. So that's just like my initial thought when you're talking about this database and also within our legal system.
Which we know exactly how the system is, and it is
Very
deeply,
flawed,
yeah, deeply
to
troubling.
say the least. Yes.
And that's putting it in the most polite and easiest way to digest, because it goes much more complex than that. And stay tuned, I'm writing a Policing in America report, and I'm devastated by what I'm finding. It is deeply troubling. I'm covering like domestic violence, sexual assault, trafficking, but also looking at like lynchings back in like the early 1900s, how they were prosecuted or not prosecuted. Looking at just policing like all across. So stay tuned for that. Anybody who's listening, It'll be on our Substack. It'll be available for people to view completely free of charge, obviously, because I'm compiling all this data and compiling all this information. It gets really intense during COVID. I noticed that there was an upward trend of gun violence. There was an upward trend of trafficking. There was an upward trend of suicides and also like mental health calls to the suicide prevention lifeline. There was a number of different things that just really skyrocketed during that point. And speaking of skyrocketing rates, we're getting into the holiday season, which brings out the best, and oftentimes it can also bring out the worst in people. So, Leah, from your perspective as a nurse, around this time of year, do you see an upward trend in like domestic violence and intimate partner violence cases?
Yeah, we definitely see some trends going on like throughout the year, especially between both sex assault and domestic violence. I mean, just for sex assault, we had a back to school campaign. I want to say it's called like the Red Zone. When college students are starting back at school, we tend to see an increase in sex assaults. But I think for domestic violence, you do see a lot more cases around the holidays just because of the added stress. I like to say that, and again, this is all my opinion, but I personally believe that all domestic violence abusers are narcissists on some kind of level because you can't say that you love someone and then turn around and hit them or put them down or make them feel less than. And when you look at personality disorder, what you're really looking at is someone who is just full of shame and fear of abandonment themselves. It's not an excuse, but that's kind of the root of narcissistic personality disorder. And so people with that disorder, um, in order to protect themselves, they somehow have this amazing ability to flip any situation when they're feeling that inadequacy to make it somebody else's fault. And they tend to focus on, a specific person, which is typically the person, their partner. Um, and so during these holiday seasons, when you're having to spend money on gifts or you're having family around and having to kind of keep this image, what we'll see is on the actual holiday, we won't see very many patients. It's directly after, right? Because they have to keep that image. And so when all of the family is around for Thanksgiving, and sitting around the table, they are looking like the best partner you could ever have. Um, but it's behind closed doors that the abuse really comes out. And so all of that stress that they were penting up during the day is going to come out later. Also, if maybe um, they couldn't afford the gifts that everybody was expecting to get, then it somehow has to be somebody else's fault that makes them feel inadequate. And so, if they can kind of flip the script to say, I do so much for this family, and you, it's you who's ungrateful, and you don't do enough for this family, and then it turns into this back and forth argument that can sometimes escalate into something more physical, just because it is about power and control over another person. In all of these instances of domestic violence or sex assault, it's not about an anger management problem. It's not about um, just wanting to have sex. It's about being in control and having that power, not only over yourself, but over everyone around you. So when they start to notice that they're kind of losing that, then kind of like they see red. And that's where we see a lot of the injuries.
Yeah, absolutely. I know how the holidays are for me. I get extremely emotional because, after my grandparents passed away, like it was like everybody just kind of went their own separate ways. So the holidays to me is just another day. I know, but I'm also grateful to be alive, and I'm grateful that I went through what I did because it literally opened my eyes to literally everything that's going on. And I honestly think that if I wouldn't have went through what I went through, I think I wouldn't give a damn about anything that's going on right now because it wouldn't apply to me. But and I just had like that mentality, it's like, oh, if it doesn't bother me or it doesn't happen to me, well, you know, then I don't really care about what's going on. But I think now it's really opened my eyes a lot. Hearing my mom's story growing up, I think it's definitely opened my eyes quite a bit. And pivoting to my next topic that I wanted to talk about is so Missouri has a thing called the 12-hour rule. And essentially, it implies that any law enforcement officer subsequently called to the same address within a 12-hour period who shall find probable cause to believe the same offender has again committed a violation as stated in the subsection against the same or any other family or household member shall arrest the offending party. What is your thought about the 12-hour rule? And have you ever heard about the 12-hour rule?
I haven't specifically heard the 12-hour rule, but there are many states that actually
Mhm.
have a rule that's not even 12 hours. If you're called to the scene of a domestic violence, somebody's getting arrested. And that's where I think that education within law enforcement really has to be good because,
Mhm.
and I honestly feel like it should be at the top of each officer's priority to have education on domestic violence because statistically those are the most dangerous calls for them. Like those are the calls where they end up getting shot or
Mhm.
harmed. Those are the perpetrators that most often, if somebody were to shoot a police officer, if you look at their history, they have some kind of history of domestic violence. If you look at mass shooters, I want to say it, don't quote me on this, but I want to say it's like 54% of mass shooters have some kind of history with domestic violence. And so when they're getting called to the scene of a domestic violence call, I mean, I just think it should be at the top of their list to want to know which party is responsible. But even like going back, like the Gabby Petito situation, right? Like who
Mhm.
were they going to arrest? Here's the issue: who are they going to arrest? You've got the victim. You have Gabby Petito, who was saying, "Oh, it's my fault. I make him mad sometimes and I'm really messy." And that's what we see a lot too, is when police are actually called to the scene, whether it's the victim that called or somebody else, many times when the victim calls, it's not necessarily that they want their abuser to get in trouble legally. They just wanted the abuse to stop. They just wanted to stop getting hit. That's what I found most that my patients would say, which was always surprising. Well, by the end, it wasn't so surprising, but if you really get down into like the psychology of domestic violence, I'd be standing there with a patient who's just like, they could have been beaten, to a pulp, and they'll just say randomly, "I hope they're okay." And I didn't want them to get in trouble. I just wanted them to stop hitting me. And so that's the issue is when somebody's called, is the victim actually going to come forward and say something? Or if they don't have any visible injuries themselves, and going back to the strangulation, right? The perpetrator is the one that might have the injury from the victim fighting back. what do we do in that instance? Because if you look at Gabby Petito, she would have been the one that was arrested out of the two of them. So that happens so often, and I completely understand where it's good to separate them at
Mhm.
least. If you're looking at a silver lining in anything, even if the victim is the one that's arrested, you're separating them. It's definitely not ideal. It doesn't give trust to the system. You think that victim is ever going to reach out again for help. Um, Probably not, but um, yeah, I think there's many states where it is either 12 hours or it's any call that you get. It's at the officer's discretion as well. So
Mhm.
I just think it really all goes back to education. And if they are going to be arresting someone or putting in those mandated arrests, like that you better be sure you've got the right person.
Yeah, exactly. And I agree with you whenever it comes to the education piece for police officers, whenever it comes to domestic violence and understanding that this is not a linear subject. This is something that is very complex, just like healing for survivors. It's that same aspect of it. And most recently, there was an article that came out um, just a couple days ago. And, I refer back to Kansas City, obviously, because I'm here, but this is also something that we're seeing across the country. But there was an article that came out with KSHB, which is our local NBC affiliate, and the headline is Amidst Soaring Domestic Violence Homicides, Kansas City's Intervention Court Shows Success. So Kansas City actually has a domestic violence intervention court, and it's by one judge, and her name is Courtney Watchell. I think is how you say her last name. Um, which we're currently experiencing a deadly surge in domestic violence. And, as I stated earlier, there's been 19 people killed this year, but this court intervention program is showing the signs of remarkable success in preventing repeat offenses. And this quote is from one of the local domestic violence shelters here in Kansas City called New House KC. And she stated, quote, this year we've already had 19 lives lost to domestic violence in the city. That's more than 50% higher than last year, said Rachel Hodgson of domestic violence shelter New House KC. Quote, we are on track for the highest in the last decade. We are seeing stressors. We're seeing things happen that are causing people at home to take the next step of violent action that they normally wouldn't have. Um, Even and then the article continues on and it says, despite the rising homicide numbers, Kansas City's specialized domestic violence court system has developed programs that show promise in preventing more serious violence. These programs target people who have received domestic violence charges, offering education and intervention regardless of whether they are later convicted or not. And this judge stated that what we see so far is that it's working. So this gives me a little bit of hope. And this court also offers multiple programs targeting different populations, like high risk offenders, first time offenders, those with substance abuse issues, and a program for people ages 18 through 16. And then there's also classes for intimate partners. She sees upwards of 200 cases every day, 5 days a week. So whenever we were talking about vicarious trauma, can you touch on that a little bit about what, from like your perspective, like what does that burnout look like? What does it feel like? Like, walk us through that journey a little bit.
Yeah, really quick, I just want to talk about the
Mhm.
the programs that are out there for
Yeah.
rehabilitation for domestic violence offenders. And I really am careful around those because I think a lot of times it can give false hope to survivors of domestic violence who really want to be with their partner. They just want to be with their potential, I call it. And like I had mentioned before, it's my personal belief that there is some kind of level of narcissism with every domestic violence abuser. And a narcissist can become more self aware of their disorder and try to make a change. But for many of them, which is it's why most people with narcissistic personality disorder are never diagnosed, because they don't think that they have a problem. So it's really the people who can sit and self-reflect, which is something that most people with NPD are not able to do, um, and want to make that change. Um, that those are the people that can be rehabilitated. But I feel like there's a lot of people who will go through the motions of these classes, just to say that they're better and they can be let back out into society. But I guess it's only time will tell. Um, and for me, just seeing so many patients who had returned, that I had seen multiple times as a forensic nurse, because their partner came back and said, "Oh, I did the work and I'm better now." And then, they turn around and do the same thing that they had done before, is really sad. And especially when you see somebody for strangulation, it's really scary because we know that someone who is strangled, it increases their risk of homicide by 700%. And then if there's a gun in the home, or the abuser has access to a gun, then it increases the risk by 500%. So um, I just yeah, I think that people who are in domestic violence relationships, I would be very cautious to say that these courses are can rehabilitate someone. It's not just a course. It's like has to be ongoing, intense psychotherapy for years, to make sure that somebody is rehabilitated. As far as the vicarious trauma goes, yeah, it kind of was something that just crept up on me slowly. Um, I could, it was not it was not just the nightmares that started, or like the random panic attacks in the grocery store that I can't even explain. Like, um, just having this like heaviness on my chest at random times, and I would just like start crying. And I'd have zero idea of what triggered that. But I think it was a lot of anger that I was feeling just towards the system as a whole, of just like trying so hard to make a change. And it's really like, unless you're in some kind of position of power, you feel like you have zero. Like zero, no power to make these changes. Like you can pinpoint, you can look at something and say, we need more of this, but then there's like a million different channels you have to go through in order to make that one change that could quite literally save somebody's life. So it was not only just the exhaustion of trying to push for change for 4 years of my life. I feel like I did more work outside of work, in trying to make change than I actually did hours in the hospital. Um, and and I think it just kind of caught up to me. There was one case that I think kind of pushed me over, and it was a sex assault case. Where somebody had a house party. They had those security cameras inside of their home, and um, I don't know, I don't get the results of the the urine tests or the rape kits. We is what it's most notably known as. But from how she was in the video, I feel like she had been drugged, and she had not watched the security camera. She just felt like something was off and had her boyfriend watch it. And he's the one that was like, let's go to the police because her sex assault was right there in like high definition camera. Um, and I think what really made me so angry was that we live in the system where she had visual proof of this sex assault, of this rape that was done to her. You could clearly see that she was unconscious, that there's no way she could have consented to this. And she was still made to come into the hospital and go through a forensic exam, which is not a pleasant exam to go through. Like, nobody just goes in to have a rape kit done for funsies, you know? And I think that's the point that really made me so angry and so upset. But then on top of that, I had said, just because my exam is based off of what the victim or survivor can remember from the assault, if they can't remember anything because there were drugs or alcohol involved, then we take some baseline swabs. From what we call high yielding DNA areas. But I said, well, if I can see all the places he touched her, then what I can do is just swab from those places. I can make a note of it in my chart, because based when it's a what we call a drug facilitated sex assault, where there's no memory, the crime lab doesn't actually run all of the swabs that we collect. It's up to their discretion, and that could be different at different crime labs, but that's what they do at ours, so that we're not just swabbing the whole body. Um, and so if I can say, no, I saw this perpetrator grab her breasts or put his mouth on her breasts, then not only do they know that they're looking for skin cells or saliva, but they have probable cause and reason to run those swabs instead of skipping over them. And so while it was probably best as far as an evidence collection goes, it was the first time that I had actually watched somebody's actual sex assault on um, live, basically, like on camera. And it's not like the movies and it's not like the TV shows, and it's very violent. And sorry, it's something that still, I think, affects me today. Um, but after that, it was just something that I couldn't get out of my head for months. It was like something that just haunted me. um, was in my dreams, was just in my everyday. I noticed that I was lashing out at people for things that I typically wouldn't um, get that overly emotionally upset about, would just set me off. And I noticed that I was becoming a completely different person. And I think that's when I realized I needed to step away, because the trauma, of not only seeing that video, but then continuing on, and every shift was just getting so busy. And it was just seeing patients one after another, and listening to these traumatic experiences and then seeing injury involved, that was involved in these very violent acts, and kind of having that realization of just, you know, how violent it really is, just kind of built up that fear, um, that it really can happen to anybody, and when you least expect it, and by someone that you trust, who is a friend or family member. And how do you continue on after that with trusting people? So I started self isolating. I lived by myself in my condo with my dog. I started walking around with a taser and pepper spray. Um, and it's just almost like I just became this shell of a person. So while it was so hard to walk away from this job, this career that I was so passionate about and that I loved, and that you know, my biggest achievement, I feel like, with every patient was walking in, seeing how the weight of the world was on their shoulders. And by the end of this awful exam that I had to perform on them, uh, they would at least look like some of that weight was lifted off of them, that I was able to provide that, that those moments of comfort for them, um, during these exams. Um, so yeah, I think vicarious trauma is very common within healthcare workers. That's why we see, of any specialty, of any career path out there, healthcare workers have the highest rates of suicide. Um, and so I think it's really important to be able to recognize those moments of vicarious trauma and make sure that you're getting help for it, and not allow it to really take over your life, to the point where I had let it get to, just because I was so afraid of losing this career that I had so much love for, um, and had basically built my identity around. Um, so yeah, that's my long explanation of my vicarious trauma.
You bring up a lot of very valid points, and I think about my time in healthcare, and just in my short amount of time in healthcare, I felt incredibly, deeply exhausted. And I don't know if it was working all the overnights I did. I don't know if it was, a combination of that, but also what I saw on a daily basis, which I worked at a very high volume hospital in my hometown. And I definitely think about it. And just as I'm not a nurse, I wasn't an EMT, I was a technician on an oncology unit, and it was definitely a lot. And during that time, I actually worked with somebody who my mom actually ended up growing up with, and she was a LPN, and she actually died by suicide a couple years ago. Um, her name was Angel, and she was an absolute angel. She was a beautiful human being. She was disabled, and it did not stop her. And remember, I tell you, she flew around that house, but flew around that floor. I mean, she flew around that damn floor, and she went quicker than me. She was older than me, obviously, but I, she was one of the most incredible human beings and one of the most beautiful humans that you could probably ever be around. But deep down inside, she was struggling very, very badly. Um, rest in power, Angel. We miss you here. I think if I wouldn't have, um, sorry, that's really hard for me to talk about. It's the first time I've actually talked about it. Because I haven't fully processed it yet, because I knew her you know, um, before I started my training of going through being a technician. And I knew about her for many years before that. My mom used to talk about her. My mom grew up with her in the neighborhood where my mom grew up at. And Angel had this very bright spirit. And she was so giving to so many. She was such a beautiful human being. Probably one of the best nurses that I've ever gotten to know. Um, but I just think about that, and I think about how many others are also feeling that exact same way. I work in the healthcare field, and I feel like that's not touched on nearly enough. So thank you for bringing it up. That just kind of inspired me to share that part. And it's deeply hard to share that because I have a deep connection to the topic of suicide. And, as somebody who has attempted suicide myself and drug overdose after sexual assault, I told Angel that, and she was like, "It wasn't your fault." She said, "Don't ever blame yourself." She said, "You cannot control what others do to you." And that's what she always told me. And I believe her. And I still believe her. So, yeah,
Thank you for sharing that. It's so difficult, and I know so many are struggling, and just like, how I had said before, how they, victims will call the police not to get the person in trouble, but because they just want the abuse to stop. I feel like a lot of times within healthcare, suicide comes about because it's not necessarily that they want to die, but you just want these feelings to stop. And there's such a taboo. I'm not to get too far on changing the topic here, but there's such a taboo on healthcare workers, particularly nurses and doctors, and um, that they're held to this other standard of, well, this is what you signed up for, right? Isn't that what we heard so much around COVID time? Is like, well, this is what you signed up for, and it's like, well, no, it's actually not. And so that's where I feel like in both instances for healthcare workers and for domestic violence patients, where resources are so important, and it just like they're different resources, and how community education and openness is really important to understanding what healthcare workers and what at the same time domestic violence survivors are going through and sex assault survivors are going through, um, because it's all the same concept, and what we really need are more resources out there. um, and just kind of like what you had said before, this was kind of halfway through the episode, with this administration cutting so many services, it's not doing anybody any favors. There are certain places, sure, we could save money, but this is not one of them. And one of the other reasons that I had quit was out of anger, because for the last 4 years, what I was able to do with my DV patients and even sex assault patients was to call the local advocacy group and show them how quick people answer. If you need somebody, if you need to talk to someone, if you're in trouble and you need help, a safe place to go or a safe person to talk to, look how quickly they're going to answer the phone for you. And I had a domestic violence patient, and it was the first time in 4 years that I was like, look how fast they're going to answer. And they didn't answer the first time, and it's because all of the applications for the on the office again sorry, for the Office on Violence Against Women were frozen, and this government has cut so much funding to violence against women, that these organizations, all of these nonprofit organizations and community advocacy centers, they're all federally funded, and so now they're having to cut services where we need more services and where we were already lacking services. And so really it's making it a less safe place for survivors to come forward. We keep saying, oh, well, we need more mental health services out there. because of all these mass shootings. And it's like, okay, but you keep adding these services, so it doesn't make any sense. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that from your perspective because your perspective is similar to mine, but it just kind of goes back and forth, right? And we're stuck in like this like tumultuous time for survivors, and I just I'm just speechless at what's happening right now. I keep thinking about it, and how can you not? Thinking about how many survivors rely on these direct service providers and these direct services, like you said, and hospitals, having to close their doors due to the lack of Medicaid funding and due to the lack of just funding in general. And it's so deeply devastating, especially in our rural communities. Our rural communities are really getting hit hard, very hard right now. And, obviously with the ongoing needs of the communities with domestic violence and gun violence and sexual assault running rampant throughout our communities, obviously the ongoing need for everything is still very, very high. And, but the higher need, it also requires a lot more funding. But whenever that funding stream is cut, you're saying that your community members don't matter. And that's literally what they're stating right now. And it's deeply devastating. Um, so, kind of pivoting a moment and just thinking about what you're doing now in like research. Can you touch on that a bit and like how it, because mental health directly correlates, into nursing, but also into survivors and finding that doing that research about like CPTSD and PTSD and, trauma. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing with like this research aspect now?
Yeah, so there's a couple studies going on right now, and I can't talk too much about them, but um, one has to do with cannabis research in preventing PTSD. Others are different types of therapy going on to be started within a certain time period of the sex assault. So, like, there's one where literally want to get someone started within 24 hours of their sex assault. So we have different sex assault clinics or like even emergency rooms that see sex assault patients. What they'll do is they'll have them watch a video, kind of explaining about the studies. And then if they want to, they can sign up to be part of the research. From there, we'll give them a call or we'll send them a text first to make sure that it's okay to give them a call. And sometimes they decide they want to participate, sometimes they don't, and sometimes they just, it's a complete ghost. Or sometimes they even said okay that they wanted to do it, but they put in like incorrect phone contact information. Um, and that's totally fine. It's obviously not a mandatory thing. But what we're trying to do is see within 24 hours, 72 hours, or within 7 days of an assault, if you can implement certain types of therapy in the long run over like a 6-month period, is that going to decrease somebody's chance of developing PTSD to the sex assault specifically? And it's also, a little bit more difficult when somebody has a history of sex assault, like this was not the first time. And so we're kind of keeping that as part of the studies as well. So yeah, it's really interesting. I think that what I like about research in this type of research is that you really can't stop bad things from happening. Like, right, like sex assault, domestic violence, human sex trafficking, those have been happening since the beginning of time. And so what we can do, what I've been trying to look into is either early education, which I helped create an online educational system, a series to help adults have candid conversation with kids about sex assault and consent and trafficking as well. It's called Walking Wise. You can look it up at walkingwise.com. And then also now doing the post assault care. So trying to figure out what therapies can help best if something like this does occur. So yeah, I still really love the work that I'm doing in both, and I'm feeling fulfilled with both aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of initiating things, one of the things that you initiated and implemented was a national protocol for the sexual assault guidelines for nurse advice line protocols and charting. I think that's deeply incredible. I just admire the work that you do and like the way that you present it. And 16 years is a long time to be in nursing. And I know it probably doesn't feel like that to you, or it may actually feel a lot longer than that. But you've been a nurse since 2009, and you've worked in a variety of different settings and variety of different specialties, and it's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels like a lifetime ago. And I'm definitely such a different person now than I was when I first started. I remember being a new grad and just being so timid and just scared of everyone and like, "Oh, I can't page that doctor. He's gonna yell at me." And now I'm like getting in between my patient and a police officer and being like, "You're not touching anyone. You're not touching my patient today. What are you doing here? Get, get whoever's in charge down here. I want to talk to them." So I'm definitely a lot has changed over the last 16 years, and I hope I just continue to kind of grow in that. I did when I was working at the nurse line. There is a national protocol through this charting system that we used at the nurse line um, uh, for sex assault. And after I took this course and became a SANE, a sexual assault nurse examiner, I was looking at this protocol and I was like, this is wildly outdated, to the point where they're like, pee in a jar and bring the urine with you. And we don't do that anymore. It's just like a defense lawyer will say, we don't know who's tampered with it. We don't know whose urine that actually is. And so now you're like we're telling victims of sex assault to go pee in a jar and carry it with them to the to the emergency room, and then we just throw it away. So yeah, so I helped to update that and it got approved. And so it was changed nationally for anyone that uses that charting system, which is across the US and in Canada. Um, and so I think it's important because things do change over time, especially in healthcare. And I think it is important that we keep updating these policies and that somebody takes the initiative to do that. So I think I'm really sad that I left SANE, but I know through like my platform where I do talk a lot about forensic nursing that I've been able to encourage a lot more people, a lot more nurses to go into forensic nursing because there is such a high turnover in it with the vicarious trauma that we always need someone to kind of like it's almost like a tap out, right? Like you're tapping them in, they're tapping you out, and they're taking over, and so we do need more people to step up and want to do this position within the hospital.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I absolutely appreciate your perspective on this. And I'm just, I'm just in awe, of everything that you've done and just being the person that you are. And you still stay so positive. What's it like going from being like nursing into like content creation and kind of like blending that? Because you're known on social media as at off the clock nurse. what's it like doing that content creation side of it? That's definitely got to be a whole switch because you're educating your audience. We've collaborated on quite a bit too, and amplifying your voice obviously is absolutely crucial. But that content creation side of it, what's that like for you going like that in between?
Yeah, it's when I first started it, actually, I was off the clock nurse was because I was doing travel nursing and I would post a lot about my travels uh in between contracts. And so it was things that I would do when I was off the clock. And so I kind of grew this platform on posting about fun stuff. and and it has taken a huge shift just because I noticed that there really weren't too many creators out there, especially within healthcare, that were talking about these topics pretty, as like the base of their platform. So while it's still off the clock nurse, I talk more about sex assault, domestic violence, human sex trafficking, bring light to these topics, and then also encourage more people in healthcare to go into this field and how to even get into the field because it's so confusing and it's so different depending on what state you're in. Um, but it is funny how I've completely, I feel like, turned over my audience. So I haven't really grown much, whereas I was significant like, consistently growing when I was doing the travel content only. And once I switched and started talking about these really intense and what I feel like are more important topics, I've kind of just stuck. I've just been kind of staying status quo, I guess, at the following that I have. And that's really something that I had to decide, is like, oh, do I want to be social media famous and have a huge following by just kind of talking about basic things, like traveling and fun stuff, or do I want to try and make a difference, even if it's just in one person's life, to let them know, you know, no matter what happened in their situation, um, that there is someone out there that will say, I believe you, and I'm so sorry that this person did this to you, and this wasn't your fault. And I think we need more voices saying that to survivors because out of the whole system from start to finish, sometimes that's all they're going to get is maybe one person saying that to them. And even if it does, their case specifically gets to court, it doesn't take back what was done to them. That's still something that they have to live with and that they have to figure out how to heal from. So I really wanted to make my platform kind of geared more towards education, not just within the community, like society as a whole, but especially within healthcare as well. Just because I do have so many people in healthcare that follow me, just from wanting to know how to get into travel nursing from my previous career. And um and I think it's really important, like having a clear understanding of domestic violence and sex assault and human sex trafficking if you're going into healthcare, because there's never going to be a day that goes by that you don't come in contact with somebody who's experienced at least one of those, whether you know it or not. And it could be a patient, it could be a coworker, you just don't know. And really, especially in healthcare, when people are coming forward at their most vulnerable, right? Is like, I don't know. I was talking to a friend and I was like, I don't know any other career path where another person would be so willing to strip down naked in front of you than being a nurse or a doctor, like allowing you to look at their naked body and then you just being like, well, this is just like my everyday, you're not looking at it as anything other than, okay, let me just look you over and see what medically you need. Um, and so people are coming into you and they're extremely vulnerable and they're looking to you to help and for advice. And if you don't, if you don't realize, if you don't approach it in a trauma informed way, approach the patient in a trauma informed way, then that can completely change their view of healthcare as a whole. And then, your whole purpose, a lot of us get into healthcare because we want to help people, right? We want to help them. We want to make people better or help them in whatever capacity they need. And so if you don't have that trauma informed care approach, then not only are you not helping that person, but you're actually harming them further because now they're not going to come forward to get help again. Um, so I think that's kind of, it's been an interesting it's been interesting working with patients and then going home and trying to put out some content. Also based off of stuff that I've learned so much. When I was in nursing school, trauma informed care wasn't even a thing. Like that's not something we ever talked about. I think we touched on forensic nursing in one, like maybe one class one day. And even then we didn't, like I didn't even know that this sane position even existed until I started working at the nurse line. So, um, yeah, I think it's really cool to be able to kind of see both sides, like to actually help patients in the hospital, and then not only be able to advocate and um, kind of address people maybe that are just watching and not necessarily reaching out. Or I have had people reach out and say, I really needed to hear this. This was really nice. That someone actually, I feel like I was actually seen finally with this one post. Or, people in healthcare that are like, you inspired me to go into forensic nursing. Or another person who reached out and said, because of the education you provided, it helped me to be able to identify someone that was in trafficking, and I was able to get them help. And that's really all we want, I feel like, in healthcare is to even just like help one person and change their life for the better. That's why we do it. We definitely don't do it for the money. I mean, unless we're doing travel nursing during COVID. Outside of that, I don't think people realize just how poor we are as nurses. So, um, but yeah, so it's been really nice to have a platform, and and that doesn't mean I don't get a ton of hate. Like I get I've been doxxed. Had my people reach out to my work and or like send me death threats, all for trying to just put information out there, which is like so wild to me. But I'm not gonna stop doing it. And if any of my employers ever fire me for something that I've said, or something that I've posted, because I do sit and anything that I post, like I stand by it, um, then those aren't really the people that I want to work for. So um, yeah, so I'm really fortunate that I have a platform, and I feel like I need to use it for something good, something productive.
Yeah, and I think a lot more content creators are starting to come onto the scene and really share their voices. And I think it's like a very broad coalition of people coming together and just amplifying these, devastating stories and these devastating statistics about the ongoing issues within our communities. And I think it's deeply important to continue using social media in the way it's supposed to be. And
Mhm.
social media was designed to create, spaces to bring people together. But we oftentimes know what social media is actually used for, and it's not for something good. And I'll be doing a deep dive into social media on a future episode with another, advocate and leader. But, Leah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Is there anything else you would like to share to those who may be listening? Your episode is a part of our Domestic Violence Awareness Month series, and I have some more episodes coming up later this month. But is there anything else you'd like to share with anybody who may be listening that might be needing a little bit of inspiration to keep moving forward in a world that continues to silence survivors and our advocates and our nurses and people that are on the ground seeing this work each and every single day?
Yeah, so something that I did for my patients is I had these little cards. They're called thoughtfuls, and it's like you can peel it open, and there's different categories of them, and they have a little quote on the inside. But sometimes the quote's like really stupid, and like why am I? This has nothing to do with me. But sometimes it's very profound. So I always would write my own quote that I love on the back. There's a little section that you can write a little note. And so for each of my patients, I would write the quote, "You are not the darkness you endured, but the light that refuses to surrender." And I just, I love that quote for all survivors of really any kind of trauma, because this what was done to you does not define you, right? But now it's the hard part is healing from that. And I hope that people take that fire that was lit in them and use it to heal, use it to advocate for others, use it to spread education, and I hope that fire never dies out on them. And yeah, just if you needed to hear it, if no one's ever said it to you before, I believe you, and I'm so sorry for what that person did to you. And 100%, this was not your fault.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's beautiful. It really is. And I'm excited to continue collaborating with you, not only through Domestic Violence Awareness Month, but just, future potential episodes. So there's a lot more that we can talk about. And I feel like I could talk to you literally for hours.
I know. I
um,
literally never shut up. So
hey, you know what? That makes the best. I've been around a lot of nurses. I really have. I've been around a lot of nurses, and I've seen both good and I've seen some of the worst. Um, but all in all,
me too.
I, all in
Ugh, ugh.
which you have a different perspective than what I do. I can imagine some that you've worked with. I can imagine some that you've seen, and I know you probably question like, "Well, that was stupid, wasn't it?" I can imagine half the conversations that you've had and half the experiences. 16 years, like I said, is a long time to
Yeah.
do nursing. You've seen a lot of
Yeah.
things and you've worked with a lot of
You know,
people. And
I I always say if you don't like me at work, if we work together and you don't like me, it's definitely because you have done something wrong. I swear
exactly.
it's because you have not advocated for a patient or you've not done your job well. So
Yeah, exactly. I definitely think you bring a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience into the space. And I'm really excited, again, to continue amplifying your voice and continue amplifying the work that you're doing. And I look forward to continuing the conversations that we'll continue to have. And to anybody out there who's listening, be sure to follow Leah on Instagram and social media at Off the Clock Nurse. Yeah. And Leah, with that, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
thank you.
Absolutely. You take care of yourself, okay?
Thank you, you too.
We're talking about